The wind was knife-sharp as it swept across the open plain, scouring the snow into pale ribbons that coiled around the boots of a man who'd stopped answering knocks. Years ago, Clint Malory stood in the doorway of his ranch house, the rusted hinges creaking faintly behind him. His coat hung open, untouched. He didn't shiver. He didn't move. At the bottom of the rise, where the trail forked from the old cattle road, a shape was coming through the drift. A woman, barely upright. Her shawl was soaked through, blackened where it clung to her ribs. She stumbled again, this time to her knees, and her arms folded protectively around the bundle at her chest. Snow hissed through the brush behind her. The sky was draining of all color, and the light turned a bruised kind of gold. Clint didn't call out. He hadn't spoken to another soul since the fall before last, and before that it had only been to the undertaker. He simply watched, hand hanging near the rifle that leaned against the doorframe. The woman lifted her face. Blood ran from the corner of her mouth. Her lips trembled with the last of her strength. "Save, my baby." The words weren't louder than the wind, just a breath, a dying leaf caught in winter. Then she crumpled forward, one arm still clinging to the child. Clint stared for a long moment, as if the stillness might change what had just happened. But nothing moved, except for the faint wail of the infant, muffled beneath wool and blood. He stepped down into the snow, his boots crunching toward the small, broken heap. He didn't touch the woman. He knelt beside the bundle instead, pulling the shawl back to reveal a girl child, no more than 5 months old, her face red from crying, her lips chapped. Her little hands were curled into fists against her chest.
Ow.
One of them clutched a leather string at the end of it, a heart-shaped locket etched with the name Lena. Clint stood again, the child wrapped tightly in his arms. The grunt of effort, he bent down and picked up the mother, cradling her over one shoulder like a sack of grain. He turned toward the house as snow began to fall in earnest, thick and gray. Inside, the cabin was cold. No fire had been lit in for days. A half-finished coffee pot sat frozen on the stovetop. Dust lay thick on the windowsills, and the rocking chair by the hearth hadn't moved in months.
Ow.
Basket lined with flannel shirts, then placed the woman gently on the long bench near the stove. He covered her with a wool quilt that had once belonged to his wife, Mary, the only thing of hers he hadn't burned after the sickness took her. With practiced motion, he struck a match and lit the stove. Flame caught the logs with a slow, reluctant hiss, casting long shadows up the walls. The child whimpered, coughed once, then began to cry in earnest. It was a small sound, but it felt like it split the room open. Clint moved stiffly to a cabinet, retrieved a tin of powdered milk, and warmed some water on the stove. He found the old glass bottle Mary had used for a neighbor's child once, years ago. The rubber nipple was cracked, but it held. He tested it with a drop on his wrist before kneeling beside the basket. "Don't die," he muttered, not to the child, but to himself. The baby latched quickly, suckling greedily. As her cries quieted, Clint exhaled like a man letting go of a rope too long held. He rocked back onto his heels and looked at the woman's still face. Her lips were blue. Her hands were small and cracked from cold. Her boots were torn at the toes. She couldn't have been more than 5. There was no ring on her hand. Clint stood and took the bottle with him to the rocking chair, moaned as he sat. The firelight caught the lines of his face, deep and rough like a droughted field, warmed the creases of a man who had forgotten what it felt like to hold anything living. He laid the child across his chest. Her breath was warm against his neck. Slowly, carefully, he began to rock. Outside, the wind howled like a pack of coyotes and pushed against the wooden slats of the house. Inside, only the fire answered. That and the whisper still lingering in the room. "Save my baby." It echoed not as sound, but as memory, curling beneath his ribs and around the hollow place where Mary's voice used to live. By nightfall, the child had fallen asleep. Her fingers clutched the fabric of Clint's flannel like she'd done it before. The bottle sat empty on the floor. The quilt remained wrapped tight around the mother's body, unmoved on the bench. Clint didn't bury her that night, sat in silence, the fire glowing low. The rocking chair moved gently, back and forth, the rhythm slow and uneven, like a heart trying to remember how to beat again. The days that followed blurred together in silence and snow. Outside, the world had vanished under white. Even the fence posts disappeared, buried deep beneath drifts that howled at the eaves. Clint kept to his work with the baby, changing her, feeding her, walking her when the cries wouldn't stop. Her little body was fragile as a bird, her breath shallow in sleep. But she was alive. That mattered. Her braid came undone. On the third morning, he noticed it while cradling her in the gray light near the stove. Just one thin plait, dark and fine, barely long enough to twist. Her mother must have done it by habit, even near death. Mary had braided hers the same way every night. Over and under, tied with a frayed blue ribbon. Clint stared at that single loose lock, his fingers reaching out without thinking. He tucked it back behind her ear. He hadn't touched hair in 7 years. He wrapped the child in a thicker shawl and went out into the wind. The woman still lay on the bench, covered in the same quilt. Her skin had changed. She was a deeper kind of stillness now. Clint didn't rush. Death had taught him long ago, there's no hurry anymore. Behind the barn, beneath the oldest cottonwood tree, he shoveled out a grave. Ground was frozen solid, but the edge of a spade and the slow weight of grief were stubborn tools. He didn't use words when he laid her in the earth. He hadn't spoken at Mary's funeral either. But this time, he lingered. The wind combed through the cottonwood's bare limbs, shaking loose ice and old bark. It dusted across the quilt like a final breath. He looked up, and his eyes moved between the 2 wooden crosses planted in that narrow stretch of earth. One faded, one new. He couldn't tell any more which hurt more, the memory that faded, or the one that had just begun. That night, he sat in front of the fire with the child on his chest, dozing. The chair creaked under him, same as it always had. He kept his boots on. Couldn't trust the cold not to creep back in. His gaze drifted to the mantel, where an old photograph leaned between 2 pewter candlesticks. It was cracked. The image faded Mary in her wedding dress, squinting into the sun, one hand holding the hem of her gown. The other curled around Clint's arm like she'd never let go, but she had. The fever had taken her after the second miscarriage, or maybe it was the silence between them that finished it. He picked up the photograph. The crack ran right through her face. The baby stirred and whimpered. A thin cry, not loud, just enough to remind him the world hadn't ended yet. He shifted and looked down. "All right now," he whispered, not thinking. She blinked up at him, those eyes dark, unsure, alive. He cleared his throat. The sound felt strange in his chest. Then, without knowing why, he leaned in a little closer and whispered again, "Lena." The name didn't sound like it came from him, but it warmed the air all the same. She blinked again, then reached one tiny hand toward his collar, grasping it tight. She didn't cry again. Not that night. Something settled inside Clint then. Not peace. Not forgiveness. But a small thread of purpose woven through grief. He looked down at her and remembered Mary's hands, the way she used to lay her palm across his chest when he couldn't sleep, like she could quiet something there. With touch alone, he stood carefully, carrying Lena toward the back room. There was still a cradle in there, tucked against the wall. He hadn't touched it in years. Dust had softened its edges, but the rocker still worked. He laid her in it gently, covering her with the same knitted blanket Mary had once made with her own hands. He stood over her for a long time, arms folded. Then he left the door ajar and walked back to the fire, sat down again in the quiet. He didn't pick up the photograph this time. He just watched the flames for the first time. In years, they didn't remind him of loss. They looked like something else, like light. The wind didn't howl that night. It roared. The walls of the cabin groaned with it, as if the storm had bones of its own, shaking every nail. Every slat of wood Clint had hammered in place with his own hands years ago. Snow blasted sideways. Against the windows, the oil lamp flickered. Clint sat hunched by the fire, Lena curled against his chest beneath a quilt, her breath warm against his throat. He hadn't slept much. The child had a cough, now dry, rasping, buried in her chest. He boiled water with cedar bark, the way Mary used to, and fed her in spoonfuls. Her little fists twitched in sleep. Clint wrapped her tighter and stared into the fire. Then came the knock. It didn't come timid. 3 sharp raps. Not the wind, not the boards. Clint stiffened, easing Lena into the basket by the stove. He took up the rifle by the hearth and moved toward the door. The cold surged in as he pulled it open. A woman stood on the threshold, wrapped in wet buffalo hide, her boots buried in snow, a braid running down the front of her shoulder like a black river. She didn't flinch at the sight of the rifle. Her eyes were dark and steady, her face worn by wind and time, but proud cut from the land itself. "I'm Naomi," she said, her voice low and calm. "I've come for the child." Clint's grip tightened on the rifle. She didn't move. "Not to take," she added, as if reading something in his silence. "To see, to make sure she's safe." The wind tore across the porch again, biting through his coat. He didn't lower the rifle, but he stepped aside. Naomi entered without thanks, snow melting in slow streaks from her hide wrap. She moved toward the fire, her boots leaving wet prints on the wood floor. She turned, pulling her braid over her shoulder. "She was my cousin. The girl you buried." Clint nodded once. He closed the door, set the rifle back beside the frame. Naomi knelt beside the basket. Lena stirred, coughed once, then settled. "She's weak," Naomi said, chest tight. He grunted. She turned, her head slightly. "You've been giving her cedar?" He nodded again. "Good." That was the end of it. Naomi stood and warmed her hands by the stove. She didn't ask to stay, and Clint didn't offer. But when she moved to the bench near the fire and sat without permission, he didn't send her out either. By morning, the snow had sealed the world shut. The front door barely opened, and the barn was only reachable by rope line. Naomi was still there, her wrap hung by the fire too dry, steam rising off its heavy hide. She boiled herbs over the fire without asking and rubbed Lena's chest with a salve that smelled of sage and pine. They spoke little. Clint didn't trust easy, and Naomi didn't press. But she moved with surety, her hands confident, her silences steady, not filled with fear, but patience. She milked the goat out back without being asked, her breath fogging in the cold. Clint watched from the window. He'd spent so long with nothing but silence that he wasn't sure what to do with this kind of quiet, the kind that didn't accuse or demand. It just shared the room. At dusk, Naomi sat beside the fire, Lena in her arms. She worked the baby's hair gently, twisting it back into a tiny braid, her fingers moving like they'd done it 1,000 times. Clint stood behind her, leaning on the doorframe. Firelight caught the side of her face, making the shadows seem softer. "You do that often?" he asked, voice graveled from disuse. Naomi looked up. "Braid her?" "Yes. My sister taught me on corn husks." Clint looked down, then past her at the mantel, at the rocking chair, the space where Mary once sat, humming songs he never knew. The words, too. The fire cracked. Naomi's fingers paused just once, then continued. Later that evening, when the child slept, Naomi wandered to the far room, the bedroom. Clint followed without sound, a shadow behind her. She stepped lightly across the floor, her hand drifting to the wedding dress that still hung near the bed. Yellowed now, but whole. A soft kind of reverence touched her fingers as she brushed. The lace. Clint's voice cut through the room like a blade. "Don't touch that." Naomi turned, not startled, not afraid. "It's hers," he said. "I know," she replied. Her voice wasn't soft. It was strong. She was loved here. Narrowed his eyes. "You don't know anything?" Naomi stepped forward. "No, a dress kept that clean and hung that high don't belong to the dead anymore. It belongs to someone still hurting." Clint's jaw clenched. "You don't speak for her." "Not, I'm speaking for you." But the silence that followed was thick and brittle. He looked away first. Naomi let go of the dress. "The dead don't mind being remembered," she said quietly. "It's the living who suffer forgetting." He didn't respond. He stood in the doorway long after she left the room. And when he finally turned, the dress still hung where it always had, but somehow, the room didn't feel quite as cold. Later that night he found her asleep near the fire, the child nestled against her side. He stood a while in the doorway, watching the flames flicker across their faces, one so young, one shaped by hard years and long roads. For the first time in years, Clint didn't feel like a ghost in his own home. The storm didn't end, it just changed shape. Snow stopped falling, but the wind stayed. It moaned low through the gaps in the eaves, brushing cold fingers across floorboards and door frames, settling in corners like old guilt. Inside, the cabin became a quiet cage. Every wall felt closer. Every silence stretched too long. Clint and Naomi moved around each other like two wolves forced into the same den. They took turns tending to Lena, feeding her, walking her, laying her beside the fire when her cough flared again. Naomi hummed to soothe her. Soft melodies in a language Clint didn't know. He didn't ask, just watched. Sometimes Naomi would catch him staring too long. She never said anything about it. But her shoulders would stiffen just slightly before turning away. They cooked in silence. Naomi made stews from dry beans and deer meat Clint had salted last fall. He boiled coffee strong enough to bite. They never sat at the table together. One would eat near the hearth, while the other tended to chores or leaned against the far wall. Lena, meanwhile, grew stronger. Her color returned. She smiled, now just little flickers, like lantern light in fog. She reached for Naomi's hair, tugged at Clint's beard, cooed when someone sang or paced nearby. Life stirred around her like smoke rising from damp wood, slow but sure, but the air in the house stayed tight. Clint felt it whenever Naomi cradled the child too long, whenever she murmured stories into the baby's ear in that soft, unbreakable voice. He knew it was foolish, this feeling he couldn't name, but it twisted hot in his gut. That the baby reached for her more. That Naomi had come in like she'd always belonged. That maybe she did. Naomi noticed. She always noticed. She said nothing until the night she found the dress. It had fallen from its nail in the bedroom or maybe been pulled. It lay crumpled across the floorboards, the lace muddied, one sleeve caught beneath Clint's boot. He'd been pacing, fists clenched, breath shallow. The room stank of firelight and anger. Naomi stood in the doorway, the lantern casting her shadow long across the floor. "You threw it." Clint didn't look up. "It's just cloth." "No," she said, stepping in. "It was someone to you, and now it's something you're punishing." He turned, sharp. "What? Don't talk to me like you understand." "I understand enough. I see the way you guard her, like the past'll come back and steal what's in front of you." He stepped forward, eyes hard. "She's mine to protect." Naomi didn't flinch. "Then stop hiding from her like she's a ghost." They stared at each other, breath heavy in the tight room. The baby coughed in the next room, one sharp cry, then silence. Naomi moved to leave, but Clint's voice caught her. "I loved someone who left me full of silence." She stopped, turned her head slightly, waiting. He swallowed. "Mary, died slow. And when she went, it wasn't just death, it was the shame. The way folks looked at us like we were a broken pair of tools, like it was my fault she couldn't bear a child." Naomi stepped back in. Her face wasn't hard anymore. It held something else, an old, raw kind of knowing. "I had a son," she said. "Once, he was taken in a raid. The men who came didn't care who lived or cried. My sister tried to fight them. They buried her with nothing but her beads." Clint looked at her then, not as a trespasser or a reminder of what he'd lost, but as someone who'd walked through fire, too. Someone carrying her own silence, shaped different but just as sharp. They said nothing more that night. Shh. Naomi knelt and lifted the wedding dress from the floor, shook the dust from its hem, and folded it carefully. Shh. She set it beside the bed. Clint sat on the edge of the mattress, elbows on his knees, shoulders drawn in tight. Later, they both found themselves back at the hearth. Lena lay between them in her basket, sucking gently on her fingers, eyes fluttering in sleep. The fire burned low. The wind outside scraped at the windows like a dog begging to be let in. They didn't speak, but the anger between them had cooled, its edges dulled. What remained was something quieter, shared. Grief didn't feel like a wall anymore. It felt like something old they both carried. Heavy but now, not alone? Asked ChatGPT. The snow melted slow that year. It didn't vanish all at once, just shrank back, inch by inch, pulling into shadows like a retreating tide. The dirt re-emerged dark and rich, full of old footprints and half-buried wood. The sun still stayed low. Most mornings, but by late afternoon, the edges of the land began to glimmer again, and ready. Clint stood out by the fence line with a hammer in hand. Naomi knelt nearby, fitting new chicken wire along the bottom of the posts. Neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't brittle anymore. It stretched, easy and steady, filled with the scrape of tools and the sound of Lena giggling from her blanket in the grass. They worked most days like that. The barn roof had lost half its shingles in the last storm. Clint climbed it one afternoon while Naomi passed him boards from below. She didn't ask for help when she pried out nails with a flat stone. She didn't offer when she hauled hay to the goat pen. They just moved like two hands on the same task. Sometimes laughter came. Once when the goat knocked Naomi flat, another when Clint lost balance on the ladder and slid down with a curse. Naomi laughed so hard she had to sit. Clint didn't remember the last time he'd heard laughter in that yard. One day, Naomi brought out colored wool from her bag and began weaving a new shawl for Lena. She did it by the fire, her legs tucked. Under her, singing something under her breath, something soft and rhythmic, full of vowels Clint didn't recognize. He sat at the table, carving the rails for a new crib from old oak boards he'd saved in the barn rafters. The smell of fresh bread returned to the cabin, baked slow in the hearth oven. Naomi added dried herbs to the pot sage. Wild onion, eh? Few bitter roots Clint would have thrown out without her. The scent filled the rooms again, turning the cabin back into something living. Gosh, she moved around the kitchen like it had always been hers. She didn't mind. One night, as thunder rumbled low in the east, Clint sat in the rocker with Lena across his chest. Naomi stood at the window, watching the clouds gather like a bruise. She turned when a sudden crack echoed outside, then a louder one inside. The rifle above the hearth had fallen. It struck the floor with a dry, sharp thud. Both turned. Naomi stepped forward and picked it up. She didn't flinch, didn't check the chamber, just looked at it for a long moment, then set it gently aside near the wall. Clint said nothing at first. Then, from the chair, he muttered, "I haven't needed it in a while." Naomi turned toward him. Her face was in shadow, but her eyes were soft. The fire popped, sending up a thread of sparks. Lena stirred, then settled. Naomi walked over and knelt beside the chair. "Shh, you built that for her?" she asked, nodding to the crib near the window. He nodded once. "Never thought I'd finish." "It—" Naomi reached out then, slowly. Not for the child, but for his hand. Clint didn't move at first. But then he opened his fingers, let them find hers. Her grip was warm, strong. He exhaled, low and quiet. Like something inside had been bracing too long and had finally decided to let go. The chair creaked as he leaned back. Naomi rose and sat beside him on the edge of the hearth rug, close enough their shoulders brushed. The fire threw gold across the floor, catching the shawl she'd laid over Lena. The braid she'd redone that morning, the photograph still leaning on the mantel above. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The warmth of the room held them. It wasn't just the heat from the fire, but the weight of being near someone who stayed, who didn't fill silence with judgment or pity, who had known pain and come through it without bitterness. Clint didn't look at the fire as memory that night. He didn't think of Mary or the graves or the winter that nearly took all three of them. He just watched the flames move and felt the quiet burn of something alive sitting beside him. Ask ChatGPT. The thaw deepened, softening the land. Where once snow ruled every edge, now came rivers quiet ones, weaving through soil. Pressing green from the earth like a second chance, birds returned in cautious flocks. Shoots sprouted in the vegetable, patch Clint had ignored for 3 seasons. The cabin, long muted by winter, stirred again with breath and sun. Naomi stood near the barn that morning, the wind teasing her braid loose as she brushed down the mare. Clint watched from the porch, Lena in one arm, bonnet tied crooked over her dark hair. Naomi hadn't said much in days. She'd been quieter than usual, and Clint knew why. A messenger had arrived 2 days ago, Comanche, from her people. There'd been a sickness. Her knowledge was needed. Her absence was no longer hers to choose. She came up the steps with steady boots and stood beside him, gaze fixed on the horizon instead of the child. "I should go," she said.
Right.
Clint nodded. "I could take her, raise her with my people. She'd be safe, fed, seen." His jaw shifted. "She is all those things here." Naomi didn't argue, just looked at him, then at the girl now tugging gently on the collar of his shirt. "You've already kept your promise," she said. Clint stared down at Lena. Not yet. The next morning he saddled the bay horse, tied the old quilt around Lena like a sling across his chest. He wore his cleanest coat, brushed his hair back with wet fingers, and tucked the baby's locket into his pocket like a badge. Naomi stood by the fence as he mounted. "She's got your stubborn," she said, softly. He didn't smile, but his nod was warm. Then he rode. The town had not changed. Same dust curling between buildings. Same cracked bell above the church. Same stairs as he passed, the child in his arms like a question they couldn't voice. Shopkeepers leaned out doorways. A few stepped back inside. The past, it seemed, still lived in their silence. Clint dismounted at the sheriff's office, boots heavy on the plank walk. The door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, Sheriff McKinley sat behind the desk, glasses low on his nose, ledger open. He looked up and froze. "Clint," he said, slowly. "Didn't expect I want her name recorded," Clint said. His voice didn't shake. McKinley looked at the child, blinking. "She yours?" Clint looked down at Lena. "She's mine." The sheriff hesitated. "Ain't your blood." Clint didn't blink. Neither was Mary's. "She was my soul. This girl's my promise." The words settled heavy in the room. Through the window, townsfolk began to gather, drawn by whispers. McKinley looked at the crowd, then back at Clint. Something shifted in his weathered face. "All right," he said, reaching for the quill. "Full name? Lena May Malory?" The scratch of ink was louder than breath. Outside, someone muttered something low. Another man old stooped, but familiar, lifted a hand and tapped 2 fingers to his hat. A quiet gesture. One that others mirrored. Then came the sound. A single rifle, raised not in threat, but in salute. It hung in the air like the note of a hymn. Clint turned and stepped out into the sunlight. His arms wrapped around the child who would carry a new name into this old town. He rode slow on the way back, Lena asleep against him. The land shimmered under afternoon light, soft and open. When the cabin came into view, Naomi was already waiting at the fence. She said nothing at first, just watched as he swung down, untied Lena from his chest, and lifted her gently into his arms. He walked to Naomi and paused in front of her. "She stays," he said. Naomi's eyes glistened. She didn't nod. She didn't cry. She just held out her arms. But Clint didn't hand the child over. Instead, he stepped closer until Lena rested between them. Not a farewell, not a passing of burden, beginning. Later, after supper, after the dishes were cleaned, and the last of the sun dipped low behind the barn, they gathered by the fire. Naomi sat in the rocker, Lena in her lap, wrapped in the shawl Naomi had finished that morning. Clint sat beside them on the floor, knees drawn up, back to the wall. The fire burned slow and steady. The rocking chair creaked not with loneliness, but with life. 3 shadows danced across the far wall, no longer a man, a ghost, and a visitor, but something whole. In the silence that followed, the promise Clint had made that winter did not echo back at him as burden. It warmed the room. Like breath and stayed, asked ChatGPT,